Welcome back to another episode of the Indy Investor Pod. Today, we are talking with some experts about the bill that was just passed, and as to strip protections of tenants was just passed. So what does this bill mean for landlords? What does it mean for tenants? And what does it mean for you? Let's get to it. And welcome to another episode of the Indy Investor Pod. I'm Brett Snodgrass, and I'm with my lovely friends today, Brian Snyder. What's going on, Brian?
What's up?
What's going on, man? And we have a special guest, Sterling Davis from Ethosity Property Management Company with his expert wisdom.
Hey, what's up, guys?
Good, man. Hey, thanks for being on the show. We wanted to have you on this show because we are talking about a bill today that was passed. And a lot of times these bills that kind of come through, they mean so much for landlords and investors and tenants too. And you are entrenched in the property management business. And so we thought, hey, let's have you on and let's get your words of wisdom on this bill that just passed. So thanks for being on the show. But I want to give a little bit of context behind what kind of happened. And Sterling, you can kind of take us through your thoughts and your feedback initially on what this bill was all about. So initially, the mayor, Joe Hogsett, wanted to pass a bill that really helped tenants, right? And there was a lot of different things in this bill that would probably be on the bias side of the tenants that would really help them, and landlords couldn't do certain things, or they couldn't evict them if the house wasn't fixed up and things like that. But that bill was actually a bill was passed to stop and to strip those protections of the tenants. So, and that could be on the other side of the landlord. So the landlords are like, yay, this is amazing. The tenants are not happy. And so can you kind of take us through what this exactly was? What was some of the language and some of the things in this bill that they were wanting to do to help the tenants out?
Yeah, so Joe Hogsett, which is the Democratic mayor in Indianapolis, put together this bill and this initiative that he felt like there was an imbalance when it came down to tenants' right and landlords. He felt like that it was more landlord focused than the laws that are presently in place than tenant. So some of the things that he placed inside of this bill was things, what you mentioned, retaliations for, like, say if you file a health department claim, landlord wouldn't be able to evict the tenant during that time. Also, we would have to give tenants almost like a responsibility and bill of rights every time a new tenant moves in. So it was things to increase the knowledge of the tenant, but two, they increase the tenant's ability to have control inside the relationship. And then as it passed through, they kind of stripped these protections from the bill, basically.
So as a property management company, let's just take some experiences that you've been through. And what does it look like if this bill would have been passed? Let's say, what would a tenant just have to do? They would just have to call up the health department to not be evicted, and that could be in some of the different things that what would work if this bill were to pass.
Right.
What would worry you as a
that's a great question. I think the worry is the same thing that they are worried about on the other side, right? Like, is abuse of power. And I think that's the worry on the other side, is abuse of power for landlords to tenants, right? So for us, it's very much a abuse of power of being able to say, now I have this thing that's levered, because it's these relationships and how they're ran right now with the health department and how we deal with maintenance is already a relationship that is it's already a process for this, right? Like right now, how the health department and landlords work right now is if they come into your house and they cite X amount of things inside your house, it doesn't necessarily interject inside of the relationship with the tenant. So if the tenant moves out next week, even though like the things are going on, those health department things still have to be corrected if the tenant is there or not. So for me, it allows now the tenant to have some leverage over the landlord, because of, and we can always think about the bad experiences, right? Like the not, it's not, I'm not fearful of the good tenants. I'm fearful of the ones that kind of understand this and will abuse this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I just want to put a little bit of context behind this too, of just kind of where Indianapolis is. So Indianapolis is known, I already think that Indianapolis is known as like a tenant friendly city. I'm talking to all my investor friends throughout the nation. Like they look at like the tenants' rights and everything like that. I'm like, wow, that's crazy that you guys have the rights like that for your tenants and stuff. So it's kind of already known as a tenant friendly city and state when it comes to Indiana. But then the other hand too is that right now Indiana, sorry, is has the second most evictions behind New York City when it comes to like cities that do have the amount of evictions and stuff like that. So,
And I think we have to make sure we put that in context, right?
mhm,
Because that is a statistic that came from a tenant rights organization.
mhm,
And I'm not saying that it's correct or wrong. I just keep on hearing that. And there's so many things that go into account. One being how we have to evict squatters from our properties.
yeah.
You know what I mean? Versus calling a break and an entry, which what it is, right? So, I mean, I'm sorry, I get off my soapbox.
No, you're good, man. No, that's exactly right though. But it also comes into context too of like I can compare. I always compare Indianapolis to Columbus because that's where I'm from, Columbus, Ohio. But the amount of tenants that there are in Indianapolis is like far more significant when it comes to like percentage of how many tenants. There's a lot of tenants in Indianapolis, which makes it a great investment city because there are a lot of people that you can buy and hold. You can do the burst strategy here because there are so many people that do need to rent. But then it's coming into of kind of some of those things. It just, I guess it all just kind of backs up to of there have been some issues with some bad landlords in Indianapolis, and some of these, larger turnkey companies that have done some unjust things and stuff. And they're, that's a whole other episode probably on that. But in talking about all this stuff is let's just get into Sterling a little bit of kind of if you are a new landlord or even experienced landlord, what are some things that you need to make sure that you're just making sure you're taking care of with your property manager and your tenant to make sure you don't have to worry about some of these issues that we see popping up?
Well, I think the thing is you have to really understand the law, because what happens is we get in these situations and we work out of emotion versus strategic, and really trying to set agenda in place, right? Because what happened when you have as a property manager, we don't work out of emotions. Like if we do this for one property, we're going to do it for another property. So it's very important for us to make sure that we have good owners that are keeping up the quality of life for their tenants and making sure the standard is there when it comes down to just the quality of the property. Those are the things that we just have to make sure of as a property manager. As a landlord, when you're doing it yourself and you're self-managing, I think it's really important um, to learn landlording and go to things like Syria and go to things like different courses that you can go through the city, to make sure that you're doing it right. Because a lot of times you like when we take over people that are self-managed, they tell us things or they send over their lease and I'm like, wait a minute, like you might have put that in the lease, but that doesn't mean that that is legal or that is going to hold up in court. And if you go to eviction court, that the judge is going to abide by that, right? Like, you can put it all day that, hey, if they are late fees, it's going to be $100 a day, right? It's $100 a day. That doesn't mean that when you go to court, that's going to be upheld because that is not reasonable, right? So I think it's very important to try to learn how to do it the right way through education and through getting mentorship and not just being one of these. But I think it's really important to get associated with organizations. Like with this article about the Indy Star, it talks about the Indiana Apartment Association is the one that backed this bill. And I'm like, who allow them to speak on our behalf, right? So I think that's why it's important to get with in-state RIA, the legislative wing of SIREA, to make sure that people weren't passing bills and speaking for us.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for sharing that. And so I really want to kind of get back to kind of what are some of the things that went on that kind of urged someone to want this bill, and just kind of maybe you can think of some examples of what you're seeing kind of around the city. But here's one paragraph that has said, that there are several examples of tenants suffering in unlivable conditions: crumbling homes, missing furnaces, no electricity, raw sewage, rodent infestations, and do you see a lot of that around Indianapolis, Sterling? I mean, are obviously this is probably why they wanted a bill like this, and that does sound terrible, right? So,
Yeah.
so yeah, you want the protections, but what do you kind
Well,
of see around?
no, absolutely. I mean, I think all that is in the Indianapolis investment world, we have heard things like, I don't know if I can say their name, Ocean Point or OP. And that probably hasn't helped the situation, right? Like those things are, when we would take over those properties for landlording, or one of my clients buying them, and we would get them in these conditions where the people haven't had water for weeks, and it's so many crazy stories like that and they manage over 5,000 rentals, right? So um, I can understand what the need is and why you want to have certain protections, but I disagree with the method in which we're trying to fix the problem. Saying like Brian's statistic, that we're second in the nation when it comes down to evictions. You're trying to fix that problem, but this bill does not fix those issues, right? Because as much as that is an issue of landlording, I think it's more of an economics issue when it comes to wage gaps, and when it comes to how minimum wage is still the same way, but rental rates have gone up because everything else has gone up, right? The cost of living has gone up. But it's our responsibility as landlord is the one to fix those issues, not the government's, but it's our responsibility. Which that's why I take, offense to, right? Like, and they're saying that we're the problem, and like you said, we do have people that are problems, and I think we need to make sure that we hold them accountable. But I think we do that already. I think we do that through the health department already. I think we do that already through MIBOR when people have license and they mess up. So for me, it's like it's acting like we haven't been correcting these issues up until this point, and it's a wild, wild west, and that's not the case. I don't feel.
Yeah, it's always difficult when they just kind of have some kind of, I guess, blanket, scenario kind of thing that they try to enforce and try to, correct everything all at once. Where maybe if they focused on certain companies and certain individuals, that might be the case that might be able to turn this around and kind of help that situation and stuff. So I kind of want to go back to Sterling, just kind of a little bit of when you are working with, so with your company, Ethosity Property Management, I know you guys do a great job and have a great reputation. And I know we're talking about these properties. None of these are Ethosity's properties and stuff that they're managing. But when we get into, you bring on a new, a new landlord that you guys are going to manage their properties and stuff like that, of, whether it's in-state, out-of-state, whoever, what are some things that you guys make sure that you guys do to kind of make sure that they are up to date on, hey, this is the way Indiana works. These are the things that we need to make sure you're doing. Your old lease might not be able, might not be able to like work with this and stuff. So how do you kind of combat that?
Yeah, I think that's I've talked with older property managers like Harvey, Harvey Property Manager, and then every Ryan Mullen of FS Houses. I think the more that you do it, the more that you become not as flexible to change who you are, right? So we kind of initially try to make sure that they're financially stable, emotionally stable, and spiritually stable, right? And then from there, we look at the properties and look at the standard in which we're taking on. Like we had opportunity to take on Ocean Point properties when they were going through, and we didn't take on one Ocean Point property. just because it didn't align up with what our goals are, like in enhancing the quality of our community and improving the life of our investors and tenants and vendors. So we look at all three shareholders. So it's very important to us to make sure that we're looking at the whole picture. But I think the thing is, like what I was saying before, is I think that it's changing though. Like beforehand, we would be a little bit more flexible. Hey, can you change this to your program to this? Can you change this? And it's like, no, we're your third party property manager. So we run everything for you and you just get a check. And that's what it becomes now. Like beforehand it was like, oh, well, if the owner still wants to be this part of it. Oh, if the owner want to choose the tenant for it, well, we allow them to do that. Now it's like, no, we don't allow anybody. We're very structured. It's very much a case of this is how the Kool-Aid's made. And if you change how the Kool-Aid's made, it's not our Kool-Aid anymore. So you need to go somewhere else to get some customized Kool-Aid that you like.
There you go. That's the best kind of investment right there, is the one where all I hear about it is when I buy it and then I never hear about it again. Exactly. Collect that check. So that's the great type of investment right there. So Brett, go ahead. Sorry, man.
No, you're cool. What's your favorite Kool-Aid, Sterling?
Definitely a great Kool-Aid.
Nice. Sounds good. So we talked about obviously the bill and how it affects, and as far as on the landlord's point of view. So I talked about a little bit the tenants, what they're saying about some of the housing conditions, and that's why they're coming out with this bill. As far as the landlord goes, they talk about that, they go through evictions if the tenants don't follow the rules, right? Which typically is if they don't pay the rent most of the time, or they tear up the property, not keeping the property up, causing problems in the neighborhood. Those are typical things that we see a lot.
Man.
And so there's this kind of tension, obviously, with the tenant and the landlord relationship. And obviously you guys probably help alleviate, maybe as a third party, that where you're trying to help each side. But do you feel like there's like a balancing act that, obviously this bill didn't pass, but do you feel like what we're doing right now is really good, that we have a good process in place, a good eviction process, and the health department they got a good process, or do you feel like there's some things that we could do better in the city of Indianapolis?
That's a great question. I think there's always room for improvement, right? I think I don't have any problem with tenants understanding their responsibilities, because I think that just a more educated tenant makes for a better experience, as well as for the landlord, right? I think, one of the things that I find from this is how much it's very important for us to figure out a way to hold each other accountable when it comes to landlords and investors that are doing it right or doing it wrong, right? So I think that's what, when I see this article talked about the apartment association, they had an authority, and they're using their authority to say this is why this should get passed, because even the apartment association wants this thing passed, right? So I think it's very important to let your voice be heard as an investor and as a landlord with organizations that are equally yoked, right? That believe the same things that you believe, that have the same philosophy when it comes down to these things, right? So for me, it's very much a case of just making sure that we are just are finding our voice and not waiting too late, because right now it's too late, right? Like, and it feels kind of too late to try to back something right now, because they're already passing through the General Assembly and things like that. So it's very important to get with an association that you see fit.
Yeah, I think you just talked about education, and I think that's really important, just educating yourself. If you're an investor out there, you're looking at Indianapolis, or you're investing in Indianapolis right now, I just feel like you should really educate yourself on the laws. Get with the local RIAs, get with the local meetup groups, property management companies that know what they're talking about. And the bottom line is investors really help our city. I couldn't imagine that if we passed all of these laws that really, are on the tenant side, and investors stop buying in Indianapolis and they buy in Kansas City
Right.
or somewhere else that's more of a landlord friendly, then what are going to happen to these houses? Well, they're really going to fall apart, right? So I just think it's really important that that we educate ourselves, and like you said, Sterling, just really doing the right thing. And investors, we have tenants, and there's just a fine line there. Yes, utilities do need to work on a house, number one. But do we need to go paint the door that looks pretty nice? I don't know. That's just kind of. But you do need to make sure it's in a livable conditions, I would say. But any kind of last thoughts before we wrap up the show, Brian or Sterling, just regarding this whole deal?
Yeah, I think for me, it's just more or less understanding the law and making sure that you're doing it the right way. You know what I mean? It's one of those things that they are bad landlords. Honestly, we've taken on some bad landlords in our time, and that is very unfortunate. But we want to make sure that we are doing it the right way, and that we are really making an impact on our community. So for tenants that are going through this, it really does bother me, and I'm sorry that they have to even go through this, because I think some landlords only look at it singular, in the thought of what the investor gets out of it. With Ethosity, we really do look at the three shareholders, which is the tenant, the investor, and the vendor who's working on the property. And I think it's very important that we look at it as a three-headed client almost, so that we bring value to all three of those people.
Yeah, I
Awesome.
think just to add on to that, I think it's just a big thing of, when you are buying a new property, make sure you reach out and make sure you have that conversation of not just assuming that, okay, I'm buying this property, it has a tenant in it, and it's gonna cash flow right away and stuff like that. They're paying everything like that, and just assuming that everything's fine. Like, make sure you have that dialogue and just make sure you have that communication. So when maybe there is something that needs to happen, or when something does happen, you already have that relationship with them, whether you're managing yourself or the property manager is managing. You can figure that out. You can problem solve through it, and it just comes back to what Sterling was saying. It's all about relationships and kind of working with everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll just kind of end the show with this, guys, because we're sitting more on the landlord position and instead of the tenants. But whenever you get a new tenant, don't put everyone in the same basket. And just like the same thing with tenants, if you're a tenant, don't put all the landlords in the same arena. We're all people, and everyone's a little bit different. And there's good landlords, there's good tenants, and then there's bad ones too. So
Amen.
hopefully you guys enjoyed this show. This is a wrap with Brett Snodgrass and Brian Snyder and Sterling Davis. And the best place to reach out to us, we're all very active on Facebook. And if you have any questions about this or any topics that you would love to hear about for future topics for the Indy Investor Pod, please reach out to us on Facebook. It's Brian Snyder, Brett Snodgrass, Sterling Davis. And we'll see you guys next time.
Later.
Peace.